Hello, we're now going to begin. My name is John Darnell. I'm with the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. I'll be serving as the production assistant for today's session. Feel free to send a message in the chat if you have any questions or need support. We invite participants to be cordial and respect all the panelists and participants and be open to differences of opinion. We invite all participants to adhere to the Neighborhood Council Code of Conduct. The panelists and hosts reserve their right to remove any participants violating this code of conduct. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters. And thank you for being here and doing this really important workshop for us.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Appreciate you joining us for this discussion on charter and ethics reform. My name is Rob Kwan, founder and organizer with Unreg LA, and I'm here with Chris Carson from the League of Women Voters, Kelsey Schwartz from Fair Rep LA, and Jamie York of the Reseda Neighborhood Council. And I just wanted to begin by pointing you to the image on the screen. That was taken from the Charter Reform Commission's final recommendations to council for the preamble. And I just wanted you to ask yourself, in the city of LA, do we have a responsive government, an effective government, an accountable government, one through which all voices of our diverse society can be heard? Does it deliver fair representation and distribution of government resources? Does it provide a safe, harmonious environment based on the principles of liberty and equality? Obviously, this is just a preamble, but if you're like me, the answer to that question is kind of depressing and unsatisfactory. This charter sets us up to fail in some ways. No matter how much work we do inside or outside of City Hall, if we don't deal with these structural problems, we're not going to see much change. We have the ability and obligation to change that as a city, and that's why we're here today. So if we could go to the next slide, and I'm going to give you a little roadmap of what we'll be discussing. First will be the basics of charter reform, then independent redistricting, expanding LA City Council, a public advocate, ethics charter reform, the municipal lobbying ordinance, and then we'll get into some quick review of how neighborhood councils can help, offer you some toolkits for your neighborhood council, and then we'll have a 10-minute question and answer at the end. So please feel free to throw any questions you have in the chat so we can have some of those lined up for the Q&A. And I'd also just want to note as a disclaimer, the ideas presented to you are not proposed to us collectively. The individual speakers are giving you their opinion. They don't necessarily reflect the views of everyone here, their organizations. This is a very juicy buffet of options for how we can change the city of LA. On that note, I'd like to hand it over to Kelsey, who's going to give you an overview of the basics of charter reform.
Great, thank you so much, Rob. So I'll be starting off our presentation with some basics of charter reform. Now, I know that many of you may be well-versed in city politics, the city charter, and how charter reform works, but I want to briefly lay some foundation for those of you who may not. So the city charter is the city's version of a constitution, and any changes to the city charter have to be approved by the majority of voters. So a charter reform measure can be placed on a city election ballot by a petition signed by 15% of the total number of registered voters in the city. The last official report by the LA County Registrar, Recorder, County Clerk given to the Secretary of State was in March of 2022, showing a total of just over 2 million registered voters in the city of LA. And that means for a charter amendment petition, that a total of just over 300,000 LA City registered voters' signatures would need to be verified in order for a charter reform measure to make it on the ballot. And a charter amendment ballot measure can also be placed directly on the ballot by an elected Charter Reform Commission's majority vote or LA City Council's majority vote, which would be 8 votes out of the 15 council members. Our current city charter is based off the 1925 charter, which has been amended dozens of times. The last major charter reform effort was in 1999. There were 2 charter reform commissions, an elected and an appointed commission. So the elected commission had the authority to place a charter amendment directly onto the ballot with a majority vote, but the 1999 elected commission worked with and made compromises with the appointed Charter Reform Commission. The final charter amendment that was passed by voters in 1999 simplified the 700-page city charter down to a 143-page document, and also created the neighborhood council system. And so I recently completed my Master of Public Policy at UCLA. And for my group's master's thesis, we spent the last year researching two types of charter reforms: expanding LA City Council and LA City adopting an independent redistricting commission. And so our thesis report delved into the many changes that have occurred since the last major reform effort in 1999, specifically looking at Los Angeles electorate, elections, and public opinion of local government. And we found a couple really successful charter reform practices in the past, such as major coalition building work, massive voter engagement, and civic education through clear messaging. And it cannot be overstated that community-based organizations like neighborhood councils are critical to successful charter reform. And so with an electorate unified by their frustration toward elected officials, there's a possibility to channel this frustration into action. Los Angeles needs a government that has the resolve to address the many constituent issues and citywide crises. So during our presentation today, we'll be outlining a few reform topics that neighborhood councils can help with that will result in LA residents being brought closer to their elected officials, increase public trust in government, and put City Hall on a better path moving forward. So making these kind of changes now will result in a more responsive and representative government that can solve formidable issues more effectively in the future. And I'm now going to pass things over to Chris.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to talk about redistricting in reform for Los Angeles, fair maps. We've just been through a whirlwind of redistricting at the state, the county, the local level, and LAUSD, all happening at the same time because of the pandemic and the delay in the census data. It was not supposed to be that way, but there was a lot of confusion. People, and you may be among them, were how to keep track of what set of rules applied at what level. But the one really great thing about the pandemic was that everything moved to virtual meetings. And so literally tens of thousands of people who really would not have paid attention to or had the time to focus and attend local redistricting meetings, county redistricting meetings, let alone the state, were able to log on and watch all of the redistricting processes taking place. And the result was a lot of informal comparing and contrasting went on. People said, well, wait a minute, why are you doing it this way and not that way? And so it really brought into stark relief the flaws in the process that the city of Los Angeles has. And, you know, why can't we do something better? Next slide. So I'm just going to briefly refresh you in what the process is now. It's not an independent advisory commission, it's an advisory commission. It is appointed by elected officials. They serve at the pleasure of the officials and can be removed at any time without any reason. There's no requirement for diversity or ban on future or previous office holding, no ban on lobbyists, no conflict of interests for staff, no ban on ex parte communication. And while the council has the authority to make laws that might cause a commission to do this, they don't have to. It's totally at the will of the council. And this time the council had some ex parte bans. Last time they didn't. Last time they had no ban on key staff were serving on the commission. So again, it's all at the decision of the council, and the commission is just that, advisory. The maps aren't final. The commission advises the council about this. These are the maps that we think are wonderful. The council can accept it. They can tinker around with it, or they can just tear it up and do a whole new set of maps. It's totally up to them. Next slide. So what can we do? Well, I'm probably not going to tell you anything you don't already know, but we'll run through it. An independent city redistricting commission would be selected by an independent body, would be independent of any office holder, and there would be an absolute ban on any communication between the office holder and the body selecting the pool that would have to represent the diversity of our city. There would clearly be a ban on office holding in the past or the future. Conflict of interest bans for key staff, a ban on all ex parte communications, a ban on incumbent protection, and of course, commission maps would be final. Of course, anybody could sue. If they didn't like it, they probably would, but they would not be able to be ignored by the council. So next slide. This new process that I've been talking to you about has already been successfully implemented, both for the state and for local jurisdictions. It honestly isn't new. Jurisdictions which have these commissions, obviously, is the state, our California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which has successfully drawn statewide maps for 2 terms. Cities such as San Diego, Long Beach, and Oakland, just to mention larger cities, there are a number of smaller cities which have it as well, have independent commissions in place, and they successfully draw maps. California's 2 largest counties, Los Angeles and San Diego, went to commissions this time. Very, very interesting process. In both cases, the commissions did not protect incumbents. They drew maps which more fairly represented the county, their counties. And their bills have been signed by the governor this week, which have added 3 more counties to the independent redistricting group: Riverside, Kern, and Fresno. So in 2030, you will have at least 3 of the largest counties by population having an independent redistricting commission. So why not Los Angeles? As I say, this isn't new. A template in a state bill, the Fair Maps Act, which created a lot of the new rounds this time, already exists. There are options within the bill to tweak it to fit a particular city's circumstances. So we don't really need to spend 5 or 6 years studying the possibility or how we might do it. The roadmap is very clearly there. The roadmap has already been successfully implemented at all levels of government in California. And Los Angeles could do the same thing if our citizens decided that that's what they wanted to do. And I look forward to answering any questions during the time period.
So the next topic we'll be discussing is expanding LA City Council. So LA City Council was last expanded to the current 15 districts in 1925, nearly a century ago. And so since 1925, LA City has grown and changed substantially in its territory, population, and diversity. 15 council members now represent approximately 4 million LA City residents. This means that each council member represents over 250,000 people, which is about 260,000 residents. Therefore, residents have to compete with 250,000 people for their council members' attention, making city council inaccessible to the average resident. People are so far removed from their council members that they're losing faith in government's ability to solve complex issues. Citywide problems continue to worsen. Issues like homelessness, housing costs, public safety, traffic congestion, they've all increased in magnitude. The Los Angeles City Council needs to expand in size in order to increase their capacity to respond, solve, and more adequately represent their constituents and bring LA City residents closer to their representatives. Having smaller districts will also lower the barrier to entry for candidates to run and win city council offices. This will allow for more diversity within the electoral process and less entrenchment of incumbent power. And so I put a QR code here. This is our group's, the UCLA Master of Public Policy thesis report for anyone new who's come in to this presentation. And it's specifically on LA City Council expansion and the need for LA City to adopt an independent redistricting commission. And you can scan this QR code with your phone's camera, copy the URL that I've posted, or you can, I'm also going to post the link into the chat right now. And then you can also reach out to me after this presentation. And so this is a graph of all of the largest city councils in the United States. And so LA City has the highest ratio of residents to council members in the nation. So the ratio to council members to residents in LA is about 1 to 260,000. So city council sizes, they do vary across the US, ranging from 5 to 51 council members with no set rule or standard. However, Los Angeles residents have less representation than any other city in the United States. And so New York City has the largest population, but a larger city council of 51 members, which makes the ratio of council members to residents for New York City about 1 to 173,000. And Chicago has 50 districts with a ratio of aldermen, which is their council members title, to residents being about 1 to 55,000. So Los Angeles City should be a leader in good government and not lagging behind. Another big issue with having a 15-seat council representing over 100 different and diverse neighborhoods is that the redistricting process itself is a near impossible job to adequately split up the city. And during the 2021 redistricting process, one of the commissioners, Michelle Pritchard, said, one big issue is that we have faced the structural constraint of only 15 council districts to represent this incredibly large, diverse, and geographically vast region. The 2021 Redistricting Commission even recommended in their final report that City Council expand to at least 22 districts and that the city adopts an independent redistricting commission. So Chris talked earlier in our presentation about redistricting and the need for an independent redistricting commission. And I'm just pinpointing how redistricting with only 15 council districts makes the process nearly impossible and deprioritizes certain communities, typically communities of color and low-income communities. And so this is another quote from one of the redistricting commissioners, Sonia Diaz. She says, through council expansion, Black Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, or Latinos can increase their opportunities to elect a candidate of choice, and neighborhoods like Watts can move into a district that better reflects their socio-cultural dynamics. Ethnic and racial minority communities can gain political power through expansion. Council members have historically been majority white, male, and wealthy, which is not reflective of the average Angelino and especially not reflective of specific council districts. So through expansion of council, the new smaller districts would have more similar demographics and needs. Historically disenfranchised communities would have greater access to their council members, greater voice on council, and greater opportunity to elect representatives that reflect themselves. And so just one specific example of a minority community that would benefit from expansion is the neighborhood of Watts, seen in pink on this map. So Watts is a predominantly low-income Black community and is overshadowed by the harbor cities to the south that are also in CD15, that are wealthier and thus politically more powerful. But Watts has to stay in CD15 due to the California Voting Rights Act requirements, one of which is each district has to be roughly equipopulous. And so the same line of thinking could easily apply to Koreatown, now unified in one council district, cities in the valley that have long felt deprioritized by council, and many other communities of color that don't feel adequately served, heard, or represented. And furthermore, MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund drew maps of an expanded city council for the 1999 Charter Reform Commissions that showed how a 25 district council could increase Latino representation from 3 to 6 and African American representation from 3 to 4. So that's just one example. An example of council expansion increasing minority representation and voice on council can also be found in New York City's expansion to 51 seats. And so when New York City's Charter Reform Commission was deliberating expanding their city council in 1989, they stated, "Our own choice of a unicameral body consisting of 51 single-member districts reflected several goals: to enhance minority opportunities to elect candidates of their own choice, to increase minority membership and minority party membership, to maintain a council of manageable size in which all members could meaningfully participate, and to increase constituent responsiveness by decreasing the size of each district." And they found that by making districts smaller, that racial and ethnic minorities had an increased opportunity to elect their candidates of choice. And over the next decade, New York City's council saw minority representation grow from 9 to 20 members from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. And that's almost a 40% of council. And so I'm going to pass things on to Rob now.
Thank you, Kelsey. I'm here to talk about the public advocate. And, the big issue here in the city of LA, it's important to remember that charter reform doesn't happen in a vacuum. If we change something in the charter, it's going to affect other areas of the charter and the power dynamics between different departments. So, just a few issues I see in our city that could be addressed by this. There's no elected official that's truly holding their peers accountable. The city is the city attorney's client, so they have a legal obligation there. The controller has a narrow mandate, focused on performance audits and money, how it flows. The DA, typically in the city of LA, we've seen over the last 10 years, is a bit shy about taking on big city politicians like the city of LA. They might go after Maywood or Bell, but LA is a different league. And in the city of LA, we've seen an increasing dominance of the Democratic Party. We have 14 Democrats and 1 nonpartisan. So, that's just an inherent problem as far as we don't have, the internal check in a way that parties can bring. Unanimous votes rule the way with the LA City Council. There's often very little discussion. Local council members kind of stay in their own hole and they are treated as ruling over a fiefdom, and everybody respects what they want to do in their own district. The mayor and the city council president carve out their lanes behind closed doors, and the mayor nowadays doesn't really play a big role in the legislative process. We kind of have a culture of silence on big issues. No one at city council meetings is there to really freely speak up without fear of retaliation. Simply making a procedural issue of something can really put you in the doghouse. Next slide, please. So a good example of what a public advocate can be is in the city of New York. They have an elected public advocate who serves as an ombudsman, a watchdog. They are elected citywide. The public advocate is a non-voting member of New York City Council. For a period of time, they could actually cast a tie-breaking vote. No longer is that the case. They are able to speak on items at City Council. They're also able to introduce and second motions at City Council. They are also the first in line to become mayor in case of incapacity or vacancy. One of the questions we've had here is, what happens if Eric Garcetti goes off to India? That question would be answered by having a clear successor there. And I'd also note that they used to be able to preside over City Council, but that is no longer the case. They elect a speaker now. Next slide, please. And the impact, how would this really change City Hall? That offers someone to turn to for accountability in government. If you're not being heard by your council member, you have somebody else to go to. That's a person that can speak up on council rules. The fact that our city council canceled a third of the meetings for about 2 years in the pandemic, the fact that we have public comment limited to about 30 minutes a lot of times, the fact that we don't have remote virtual public comment. These are things that a public advocate would be empowered to speak on. They are a citywide voice on a check where we have that local deference. So if there is a development project that stinks in someone's district and everybody council is afraid to speak about it, we at least have somebody that might be more inclined to speak up. They're also an ally for council members that are trying to introduce a controversial idea, or the council president has told people not to sign on to a certain motion. That's something that has happened with different reform proposals. And to get something introduced in council, you need somebody to second it. That also offers a counterweight to the happy family, somebody with a citywide profile to speak up on issues in the news. And a public advocate in New York was more than willing to speak up about police brutality during the uprisings. So it just offers somebody that's a bit more inclined and there to speak up on city issues and offer a bit of a positive disruption. One note is that you really need to have a protected budget. The New York Public Advocate does not, and they've had problems with their subpoena power. So you just want to have clarity on that so that they're fully empowered to do their job and carry out investigations. And the next topic I wanted to go on to was ethics charter reform. If you could change the slide. And I'm going to try to go through quickly, but our city ethics commission was a model for the nation and world 30 years ago when it was created. Now it's a bit outdated. The strengths of our current commission, they handle a lot of issues with very little resources. They do a whole lot with the little budget that they do get. We have an advanced searchable database for campaign finance and ethics records. In other cities, you got to pour through PDF files. And that's if they're even available online. Sometimes you have to go in person to inspect them. They have tools for you to aggregate data on behested payments, lobbyist fundraising, all kinds of stuff. You can see where money is coming in geographically. The Ethics Commission assists with compliance. We have some of the most strict laws in the country, so it's really important to have somebody to turn to because not everybody can afford Kaufman Legal at $10 million. They have helpful resources for officials, candidates, the general public. If you ever call into the Ethics Commission, you'll be kind of blown away because you're like, wait, I called city government and they were actually really helpful and responsive. Some weaknesses, they are underfunded. The LA City Council often ignores their policy proposals. They don't have that full independence there because they are appointed by elected officials. Enforcement can take a long, long time. And sometimes the fines are simply viewed as a slap on the wrist, the cost of doing business. And they're not really equipped to address the hard corruption we see in the news. They are not the FBI. They're not there, running informants or wiretaps, things like that. So we can't have this expectation that they handle all of that, but there's a whole lot more we can do. If we can go to the next slide. The Ethics Commission this summer issued a set of recommendations. This wasn't a formal policy proposal, but kind of some discussion points on things they'd like to see changed. Good things they want to do: increase the fines per violation, give them independent counsel, a lawyer that they can talk to that's not biased like the city attorney, because the city attorney wants to prevent them from getting sued. So they'll actually be able to get objective legal advice, which can be really important when the city attorney says, oh, well, I have a really narrow view of the charter and you can't do that. Their recommendations would have a time limit where council would have to act or they become law, and they could also put measures directly on the ballot, like the City of San Francisco's Ethics Commission. There are some screenings so that bidders and contractors and developers can't serve. It also streamlines the process for carrying out an investigation. So that's something that's important as well. The bad things about their proposal: it gives them a really inadequate budget and freezes it. A budget that's barely above the one they have right now by a couple $100,000. It increases the number of elected officials who can remove a commissioner and lowers the threshold to a majority for removal, which I find concerning. The biggest problem is you still have elected officials appointing those responsible for overseeing them, which is highly problematic. We've seen in instances in the past where, when Eric Garcetti was elected to council, not long after Gil Garcetti, the former DA, was put on the Ethics Commission. We had the wife of a developer who the developer had previously been fined for violating ethics laws, and Herb Wesson appointed him to the council. And once again, or he appointed his wife, and then once again, he fell under the Ethics Commission's enforcement arm. There also are no restrictions on candidates, former candidates, bundlers, consultants, former elected officials serving as commissioners. So that's problematic. If we can go to the next slide. Assuming we fix this, assuming we went with something like the city of Oakland or Long Beach, where the commissioners apply through an open process and are selected by the commission itself, that ensures we're removing the elected officials from the appointment end. If we fixed all of that, we could really have something where it changes the power dynamic at City Hall, how policy flows. It would empower them to actually do their job. They'd have objective legal advice. They'd be protected from retaliation. They'd be able to, bring much harsher penalties on people who are doing wrongdoing. Streamlined enforcement saves money. It would, and most importantly, I think this is the biggest problem in the city of LA. We have a really big soft corruption problem. Things that might not qualify as bribery, but they're really problematic. And there are a lot of instances where basic laws are not followed in the city. For example, on the eve of Heather Hutt's appointment, I found out that she never filed her statement of economic interest, her Form 700. And she filed it within an hour of me asking the Ethics Commission for it. And she only completed her ethics training 2 days ago, even though she was appointed 3 weeks ago and has been on as a chief of staff for 6 months. So, when we have that culture where people aren't complying with the basics, that makes them feel like they can get away with a whole lot. So I will end there and hand it over to Jamie. There are some recommended changes in that link, and you can find out more in the toolkit.
Hi, Jamie York. So if you know me, you probably know me from the Municipal Lobbying Ordinance, which is a topic I've been talking to a lot of neighborhood councils about. But it actually really echoes really well with what Rob was talking about, with that the City Council frequently ignores recommendations from the Ethics Commission. And the Municipal Lobbying Ordinance is a perfect example of that. There's been 2 other previous attempts at comprehensive reforms of the Municipal Lobbying Ordinance since 1994, which is when the last time it was comprehensively updated, but both of those died in committee. And so what we see is that oftentimes City Council will talk a lot about wanting to implement reforms, but the reality of it is that often those reforms go nowhere or get watered down. So I want to talk about the MLO and why it matters. One of the things that it would do is it would eliminate the hours requirement, and it would move to a compensation model only. In 2006, when voters approved expanding term limits for City Council, there were a number of lobbying reforms that were also approved, but one of those reforms actually took away the compensation-based model of defining a lobbyist and moved it to one that was based on hours. And that's created a loophole that a lot of lobbyists have exploited. If you looked at the Budget and Finance meeting a couple years ago, Bob Blumenfield asked the question, I have these meetings with lobbyists, but then I go to look them up in ethics and nothing's listed. But if they didn't do the hours, then there's no requirement. So you can't track the money, you can't track the client. So the number of things that the MLO would update are really great because it eliminates that loophole. It closes the registration loophole that sometimes allow the lobbyists up to 40 days to actually do their disclosure. It would require the lobbyists to register the matter and the position taken that they're lobbying for, better disclosure of fundraising activities. It would also ban lobbying clients from giving gifts to elected officials. Presently, that's not banned. Instead, it would go to a $25 limit per year. So no more fancy steak lunches. And it would also raise the cap on civil penalties for lobbying penalties, which would be really important because right now it's not a huge amount. Next slide. So the question of who is a lobbyist is what's really important. Right now, it's defined as that they're compensated and they spend at least 30 hours a month in a 3-month time period to influence legislation. And they have at least one contact with a city official that's not administrative in nature. So just filling out a form wouldn't count, but contacting the council member to say, you should do this thing for my client, that's what we're looking at. Going to a neighborhood council meeting, that's what we're looking at. But the proposed change in definition would make it much simpler, both from an enforcement policy in terms of being able to really nail it down. It would basically be $5,000 in payments in a consecutive 12-month period. And again, at least one contact with the city official that's not administrative in nature. It's a much clearer definition, a much easier to investigate one, because whether or not money changed hand is a simple yes or no question. Next slide. So there are current lobbyist restrictions. They can't donate to city elections, which is good. It would bring down, there's a $1,000 behested payment disclosure. So if a council person asks a lobbyist to donate to their favorite charity, if it's the regular public, if it's 5,000, that's when it gets reported. But for a lobbyist, it's 1,000. There's formal registration processes and public disclosures, including their clients' payments and activities. But the proposed changes would eliminate the gifts from clients as well. Next slide. So the part for neighborhood councils, which is where I started getting really involved with this, is that presently the MLO only requires disclosure from lobbyists in written communications. But with the advent of Zoom, the advent of everything going online, there's no requirement for a lobbyist to disclose who they are. And we've seen time and time again that lobbyists have come to our meetings, not disclosed that they were lobbyists, and advocated for things in our meetings. So with the new MLO, they would be required both in writing and in oral presentations to say, I am a lobbyist and this is my client, is the first thing that they would have to say. And I'm really proud to say that 35 neighborhood councils, the neighborhood council budget advocates and the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners have all supported changes to the MLO that would require this oral disclosure. Next slide. So one thing I did want to talk a little bit about was the nonprofit exemption. Right now, the City Ethics Commission is recommending a $2 million exemption, but I believe that that recommendation is not great. Basically, if you look at this chart, 16% of nonprofits have revenue above $1 million in Southern California. So if you raise it to 2 million, you're going to exempt almost every single nonprofit. But if you're not required to file as a lobbyist, then you can track the activity, then the public can see it. So I've been advocating for knocking that down to 200,000 in revenue or 500,000 assets. That's what San Francisco currently has in its ethics commission, but it also aligns with the IRS tax code. So it makes it really easy that if you file a 990N or a 990 Easy, not a lobbyist. You file the more complicated form, you are a lobbyist. Really simple and straightforward. And I think as we've all seen at City Hall, nonprofits are frequently used to advocate for issues in City Council, sometimes that are outside the purview of the things that are their general mission. And we've all seen that. And I think that the public deserves to be able to track that activity and to have that activity disclosed. Next slide. So how can neighborhood councils help? If you're interested in looking at council expansion and better maps, you can join the Fair Rep LA Coalition. We have a Google form. Your neighborhood council can file community impact statements. We've created a neighborhood council toolkit that has 3 different CISs that neighborhood councils can file on these various issues and support. And also all of us are available for questions. Next slide. And that's the toolkit on the different things that we're advocating for neighborhood councils to file on. But I'd love to get to questions because I know we're a little short on time.
So I know one of the questions that we got was on salary and cutting them in half. And that's something a lot of us have discussed as part of expansion. And it's important to remember, like, we got to the point of having high council salaries as a result of our elected officials doing moonlighting on other jobs that were conflicts of interest. Specifically, Mayor Bradley was serving on the board of a bank at the time, and they were getting money, like they were doing business with the city. And that's what triggered those big ethics reforms 30 years ago and gave us salaries that are tied to judicial salaries. So it is important to make sure that they are adequately paid, especially because if you have too low of a salary, as somebody mentioned in the comments, that really limits who could actually serve as an elected official. And we don't want to just have a situation where, you know, only the most advantaged and wealthy can serve in elected office. They do have an extremely difficult job, and we have high expectations. So, you know, whether or not our current specific salary is the exact one we should be looking at is another. But I think that roughly speaking, we shouldn't be looking at having it. That's just a pretty dramatic reduction in their salary, especially for the city of Los Angeles. So there was another question on public advocate and what kind, would they have parliamentary powers as in the House of Representatives, or would that role be that of an ombudsman, neutral, informative, without power to remedy issues? I'm not 100% clear on the question, like their general job is an ombudsman. Parliamentary wise, they New York City no longer has them serving as the person presiding over the body. That used to bring with it a little bit more power. So that could or could not be something we choose to incorporate. But specifically, they are able to speak on items at council, and they are able to make motions and second motions. So are they able to, make a full use of Robert's Rules of Order and the council rules and in those dialogues at council? Absolutely. Any other questions, or any of my fellow panelists want to hop in and add anything else? There was a question in the chat on salaries in New York City. I do not know that. I turned to Kelsey. Do you know?
I do not know. But, off of the salaries and, cost is one of the big things that people bring up. I'm going to share just this slide from our thesis presentation. And so this is the cost of a council expansion. And this is a range, from expanding to 23, 30, 50, just to name a few. And it is a fraction of a percent of the annual city budget. And so when we're talking about, salaries or staffing, the whole point of expansion is to make city council more responsive, solve these really expensive problems like homelessness, housing shortage, traffic congestion, these other things that are way more expensive. And so, it's not a huge cost when we look at all of the other money that's being spent. And, we just have to look at what are our priorities as a city when we're talking about city budget.
Hey, this is John. I just wanted to say, maybe if you have like one more minute, if you want to wrap up any closing statements or anything. We have about one more minute.
Well, I really hope that your neighborhood councils will consider weighing in on some of the various issues that we've brought up. The MLO, it really deserves a fair hearing, and it hasn't gotten one since I was in 5th grade, and I'm nowhere near 5th grade anymore. So we have, I think, the chance when we raise our voices as one to talk about the things that City Council has refused to take on. I think we have the chance to make a real difference. Right now, ethics is taking comment on the Charter 700 modifications that they're proposing. There's a lot of really good stuff there, and it's really an issue that's well worth examining by your neighborhood council. And in addition, there was just the motion of 4 months too late to report back on independent redistricting. So it would have to be for the 2024 ballot based on the request for the report back. But these are the kinds of issues that are big picture things that, they're outside the scope of just our own unique neighborhood, but they affect the entire city. And it's my belief that this is the kind of thing that neighborhood councils were made for when we were created in 1999. When the city council won't hold itself accountable, it's up to us. And that's the kind of work that we need to join together to keep doing. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for the support that you've had so far. It's really incredible.
I would just add, the MLO is beautiful because we can do it tomorrow. And charter reform might seem big, but it's really just 8 votes. And there are a lot of candidates on the ballot right now, and we could have a dramatically different city council in January. So we're a whole lot closer than it may feel.
Thank you all. Well, let's have a virtual round of applause for all of our presenters, and thank you all for sharing your time to participate in this session.